Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Conscious Business Coffee Break, where we take a few moments to explore what's happening in the conscious business movement, expand awareness, and encourage your efforts in conscious business. My name is Stephen Donaco of the Conscious Business Enterprise, a division of Humanities team. And today on the program, we talk about value-based banking. So my own background is partly in the banking world. I worked in the banking business for a number of years in both retail and private banking environments. And I worked in Chicago. So my experience is in Illinois. And the unique thing about banking in Illinois decades ago, was that it was not legal to have branch banks. A bank had to have one location, and meaning that it served the community that it was in. So a bank couldn't legally have another branch in another location. And this basically meant that all banks served the local communities in which they were based, which makes sense. So this is interesting because as the laws changed in Illinois, of course, the bigger banks came in and consolidated and bought up these small, literally community-based banks. So, we've gotten to the point now where we have these, so-called too big to fail institutions, which are massive, and they are in our local communities, and they're not invested in the communities the same way as those original individual community banks were. Now, the good news is that's changing, and there is a recognition by both the industry and banking customers that it behooves us all to provide financial services at a local level. So I came upon this article that I'll share with you in the comments to this video around an idea called value-based banking. And it's interesting because this is like what I call a back to the future kind of phenomenon where, as I mentioned in the past in Illinois, there were these individual banks serving communities. And now we moved to these large-scale banks, and now we're getting to this point where people are recognizing in the industry, well, let's have these community-based banks again. So it's like a back-to-the-future phenomenon. And in value-based banking, increased access to financial services is only one part of the financial sector's ability to do good. And in value-based banking, as you might expect, the values of people, planet, and prosperity are key. And so it's interesting that in value-based banking, instead of profit, they call it prosperity. And in our Conscious Business Enterprise program, our tagline is a new paradigm of prosperity. So the four methods of value-based banking include, number one, building for the long term. So value-based banks look beyond short-term gains to ensure long-term economic resiliency for both the institution and for the customers and the communities that they serve. So what this does, the benefit of this, building for the long term, is that it opens up other opportunities that short-term investors simply overlook. For investors looking to just get a quick profit on flipping something, they're not going to be interested in the long term. And this is where value-based banks come in to fill that gap. And then secondly, there's a dedication to the investment. So if you're building for the long term, you're in it. You're going to be interested in supporting that investment throughout its lifespan. So you actually have a deeper connection to it. So the second method of a value-based bank is working locally. And this is where those banks are committed to supporting the unique needs of the communities in which they work. So this is that back to the future phenomenon that I talked about. In the days where banks were really community banks, they were interested in their local communities because that's where their customers were, and they were interested in those activities and those businesses. So value-based banks are doing the same thing. And this means that they can create creative programs, let's say for their commercial customers. So, for instance, they can create a rewards program to support spending at local businesses in partnership with those business customers. Another example of working locally is that they are deepening relationships with both their customers and with the community. And they have an interest in being involved in the community as opposed to extracting value from it. A third method of value-based banking is focusing on what's called the real economy. And this is simply meaning that value-based banks do what we think banks should do, is to lend to people, take deposits and lend money. And they prioritize providing loans to businesses that are producing goods and services for the benefit of the community versus trading in the financial markets, which is what these large institutions do to a great extent. They're making short-term profits through trading, and they're not lending to the same extent as these community banks or value-based banks do. So the focus on lending is the prioritizing people and communities over that short-term profit. And then the fourth method of value-based banking is to align the lending portfolio of the bank with their values. So value-based banks align their lending portfolio with their triple bottom line values of people, planet, and prosperity. They avoid investments that are at odds with those values, and they actively seek out opportunities to support doing the most good for the communities, for the people, for the planet, and for prosperity. So, for example, value-based banks will invest in things that the larger institutions will tend to stay away from because they deem it as too risky or not short-term enough. And examples of those investment opportunities for value-based banks are specialty agriculture, renewable energy, green building, and low-income housing. So how can you support the expansion of value-based banking as a consumer? So you're not a banker, you're a consumer, but you like this idea. Well, the first thing would be to consider joining a value-based bank near you. And in the comments to the video, I will put a link to a map, a global map, that shows where there are member banks of the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. So these are institutions that you can join and support if you're looking for a value-based bank that's currently in existence. But if you're in an area where there isn't a value-based bank, the other thing you can do is advocate for your existing financial institution to take a values-based approach. And this might be with a local credit union or another smaller regional type bank, and you can just advocate for that. And as a customer, as a consumer, you do have the power to express what your needs are and what your community's needs are. So I'll put a link to both this article and that global map of value-based banks in the comments to this video. So happy to share this information with you today. Thanks for joining me on the Conscious Business Coffee Break. Thanks to Uptown Cafe in Valparaiso, Indiana for giving me a table here to do the program today. And we will see you on Friday, 9 a.m. U.S. Central Time for another edition of the Conscious Business Coffee Break. Have a great day, everyone.